Thank you all for joining us for live Q&A and office hours with Dr. Karen Levy. This session is a follow-up to Dr. Levy's video lecture, Robo-Truckers, the Double Threat of AI for Low-Wage Work, that you've already watched, and a precursor to her forthcoming book, which I'm sure she's going to tell us about. Once again, Dr. Karen Levy is an associate professor in the Department of Information Science at Cornell University. Please join me in celebrating her tenure, which recently happened. I heard it on good authority that I'm the first to call her associate professor. She's also an associate member of the faculty of Cornell Law School. She researches how law and technology interact to regulate social life, with particular focus on social and organizational aspects of surveillance. Much of Dr. Levy's research analyzes the uses of monitoring for social control in various contexts, from long-haul trucking to intimate relationships. She's also interested in how data collection uniquely impacts and is contested by marginalized populations, which is a particular importance and interest to our site, our SICSS-Howard Mathematica site, which focuses on anti-Black racism and inequity. So we went looking for you, and I'm glad you said yes. Dr. Levy is also a fellow of the Data and Society Research Institute in New York City. She holds a Ph.D. in sociology from Princeton and a J.D. from Indiana University Maurer School of Law. Dr. Levy previously served as a law clerk in the United States federal courts. If y'all don't know, that is a big deal, okay? So we have a superstar amongst us, and we're so happy and so delighted by your presence. Maybe we could start off for those. So we've got a group of people who have watched the video. You have some fans in the room, but for the people out in the stratosphere who've not seen the video, can you give us the 60,000-foot level of this project, this book, and what got you into it? What got you into truckers?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nanya. That's like a lovely, lovely introduction, and I can't tell you how honored I am to get the chance to join all of you. So thank you so much for the invitation. Yeah, I can't imagine something I'd rather be doing with my time than this. So I appreciate having the opportunity to be with you. Yeah, my work and the trucking project specifically are kind of my effort to investigate the relationship between technology and rules, especially in the context of labor and especially in the context of the trucking was a little bit of an accident, to be completely honest with you. I was really interested in the idea of digital enforcement and the idea that, sometimes you have a rule that is being enforced and then there's a kind of a, groundswell to start enforcing that rule digitally, whether that's through monitoring people to investigate whether they're breaking a rule or coming up with ways to make it more difficult for people to break a rule, right? There's lots of kind of different flavors of digital enforcement. So I was kind of on the hunt for something, some context where I could look at that. And I really wanted it to be a labor context just because labor has always been of interest to me. And so I found out, this was way back in like 2011, which is when I started working on my dissertation, that truckers were maybe soon going to be required to be digitally monitored by the federal government in the name of ensuring that they weren't driving more than they were allowed to, because there are caps on how much truckers can drive every day. And so I heard this little story on NPR. It was kind of a fluke. And then that day I didn't know any truck drivers, but I went to a truck stop and I just thought, well, let me just see what it's like to actually talk to these people. And it turns out it was incredibly easy and really fun. Truckers are kind of everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Like, a lot of people, don't look at them or talk to them or acknowledge their existence. But it turns out that, like many people, right, like when you actually stop and ask them about their lives and their stories, they have much to tell you. And so I found it really easy to spend time with them and to learn about their lives. It's like really, really humbling, I think, to do qualitative research. That's an experience I didn't know I was in for, right? Nobody really tells you that, people will just be really generous with you, right? Qualitative research depends on other people's generosity. And people just kind of welcomed me into their lives and their trucks and told me about, their families and their histories. And I just got really addicted to it. I really liked this group of workers. So I tried to tell their story. So that was my dissertation. And then the book that is being released later this year is kind of an update of that work. It contains some of the dissertation work, as well as kind of looking at the relationship between surveillance, which was kind of the initial focus, and then automation. So understanding kind of the role of autonomous vehicles and of AI in supervising what truckers are doing and maybe in trying to kind of substitute for their work.
So I have to tell you, one thing that surprised me, and I think this leans into what you mentioned about how in many ways truckers are both visible and invisible. and that many folks don't invest time in thinking about their lived experience. But they bore a disproportionate sort of impact of technology. Like there is a deep connection to technology that I just would never have thought about. I think my understanding of the lived experience of truckers is probably more analog. So can you talk about their sort of willingness to adopt technology? What types of things are on board that many of us may not know unless we've climbed into the cab?
Yeah, which I would encourage everyone to do. It's an interesting technological environment. And I think I had the same feeling when I started to work with truckers, which is like, oh, these are not like tech early adopters, right? Like that's kind of not the image of a truck driver that a lot of us have. And some people are really resistant. Like I remember one driver, wanting to tell me that he not only didn't use GPS, but he like didn't use maps. And he would like encourage me to give him 2 cities in the United States, and he would just like name the route between them. And they were all right, because he had that road knowledge, right? He had built up that knowledge. So there is some pride, I think, in having the experience, having the lived experience that lets them be good at their work. But at the same time, in many ways, truckers are, early tech adopters. And it's always, I think, interesting to find segments of the population that we might not think of as techies, but who actually trucks themselves are immensely technological systems that truckers tinker with and repair and personalize, right? Like we might not think of them in the same breath as we would like hackers or something, but they are in many ways, the same as farmers, the same as many other groups that, end up needing to engage with technology in their day-to-day lives. And there are a lot of technologies that are in trucks that like are not put there because the trucker wants them, but because the government or their employers or their insurers want the technologies to be there. So I talked about some of these in the recorded talk, but more and more we see camera systems in trucks. We definitely see GPS tracking because that's now required. We see more biometrics, right? So more wearables that are trying to determine if the trucker is overly fatigued. Things that are kind of on his body or looking at his body, looking at kind of how often his head is nodding to see how tired he is, or looking at his eyelids, things like that. So, some of these are things that we see in a lot of different workplaces, right? So in Amazon warehouses, or, many other contexts where biometric authentication is becoming more common. But truckers are definitely like feeling the brunt of some of these new technologies really in spades, and in ways that, again, like don't really accord maybe with kind of the freedom or autonomy that we sometimes associate with that job.
So one cool, I'd say, peculiarity about our site, and this is because I'm a feminist. So almost all of our rooms daily, or our passwords, are Black women. So Black women poets. Today we had Black women superheroes. So I would love to hear about any experiences that you had with women truckers.
Yeah.
So since it's such an extremely like masculine culture, and you mentioned, and as you were describing this guy telling you, I can get to a city without a map. That's just what I was imagining. Given the great resignation and sort of persistence of labor shortages, are you seeing more women? Can you talk to us about the experiences you had with women truckers?
Yes, I would love to. I would love to talk about that. So definitely it is the case that trucking is kind of is thought of as a quintessentially masculine endeavor, right? And that's cultural. It's partly demographic. So it's about a 95% male population, although it's hard to get good statistics, but it's up there in the 90 something percents. And also like that bears out culturally. So if you look at kind of trucking media or trucking pop culture, kind of a heyday of the trucking movie era in the 1970s, things like Smokey and the Bandit and stuff like that. I mean, all of it really emphasizes machismo and virility and stamina and other kind of cultural constructs that we tend to associate with masculinity. And a lot of truckers themselves kind of think of themselves in kind of this cowboy mentality. And there's some really good writing on kind of the association between trucking and masculinity. But that said, the number of women in trucking is growing quite a lot. The number of immigrant groups in trucking is growing quite a lot. To say it's rapidly diversifying is kind of like said, just shows you how few people there are in trucking who are not men. I think right now I have to check the latest statistics, but I want to say that there's like 5 or 6% women in trucking, which isn't very much, but is a pretty marked increase from where we were a few years ago. But the kind of dark side of that, right, or kind of like the kind of the other side of that story is not that like more women are entering trucking because they want to, or because it's so great, or because trucking as an industry has sort of seen the value of diversifying. It's honestly because, as you pointed out, there's a big shortage, right? There's a big shortage of labor in the industry. We can't get enough truckers, right? The turnover rate in trucking is more than 100% a year, right? So every trucker on average will leave their firm. at least once a year. And because of that, trucking companies, there are options, right? Like what they could do is actually improve the quality of the work, or improve the wages that they give to workers. What they have chosen to do instead is kind of just like churn more people through the job, right? So the job is no better, right? They haven't really improved the material conditions of the job, but they have started more proactively reaching out to women, reaching out to young people, trying to get the trucking, the age at which you can get a commercial driver's license lowered from 21 to 18 is like another big thing they've been doing. You do not want to be next to an 18-year-old behind the wheel of a semi-truck. But that's like been another thing they've been doing, right? Is trying to kind of reach out to groups that they haven't engaged in the past, to try to kind of churn those groups through, right? Just to kind of fresh meat for the grinder, which is not great. Women certainly face more sexual harassment in the context of training. So there's a really wonderful group called Real Women in Trucking that has been kind of advocating for the federal government to acknowledge, some of the harassment and abuse that can occur in the training process. The other thing is that some of the surveillance and privacy invasions that occur in trucking really fall much harder on sexual minorities, on gender minorities, on women, and on Black drivers. So there's an absolutely wonderful book by the writer Anne Balay. Her last name is Balay, and it's called Semi-Queer. It's like my favorite book in the world. She does an oral history of gay, lesbian, women, and Black truck drivers, and just kind of talks about how, this oversight that they face falls so much more harshly on groups who are already marginalized within the workforce. So just one quick example that she gives is that, there's lots more cameras in the cab of a truck these days. Trans drivers in particular often feel unsafe going into truck stops to use the bathroom for reasons that are probably obvious. So one thing that a lot of trans truck drivers have started to do is to like have a portable toilet in their cab. Now, of course, if there's a camera in the cab, like that's going to affect those drivers in a very different way than it would drivers who feel safe entering a truck stop to use the bathroom, right? So that's like just one example. But certainly there are some major downsides to the way that the industry has kind of received these drivers or not offered them the protections that they should.
It's so interesting that you mentioned the cameras in the cab. I recently became aware, I think it was a New York Times article, about how their Airbnbs are allowed to have cameras in public areas. So you could be in an Airbnb, and as long as it's not in the bathroom or the bedroom, and there isn't a pull-out couch in the living room, there could be a camera. There could be 20 cameras, and sometimes it's in the small print. I wonder if you've come across this. I study privacy, cybersecurity, and surveillance, and one of the things I often encounter when I tell people about my research, and I wonder if this is true with truckers or if they are more sensitive to surveillance. I tell people, "Oh, aren't you worried?" And they go, "I'm not doing anything. The government can watch me. It's fine. I'm not doing anything. What am I going to get in trouble for?" So I wonder if you've seen a difference in the way that and I'll expand it. Let's do intersectionality across any of the groups that you've interviewed. Who seems to be the most sensitive to surveillance, and are you noticing differences across groups? I'd also love to know if there's a lobby in this space that has taken this up. Is this what is it, the Privacy Rights Clearinghouse, or the Future of Privacy, and who are the voices in this space for truckers, if there are any?
Yeah, those are great questions. Certainly it is the case, I think, that truckers, more so than the general public, are pretty highly sensitized to just government and bureaucracy more generally. A lot of truckers, if you ask them like why they got into trucking as an occupation, many of them will tell you, like in no uncertain terms, that they did it because they wanted nobody looking over their shoulder all the time, right? They kind of bristled at, factory work or, work in a warehouse or something where they, other kind of low wage work where they felt as though they were being closely supervised. A lot of, obviously it's a 2 million person industry, so there's a lot of personal variability. But a lot of people will tell you that, right? So it's a group that has sort of self-selected for more personal autonomy, and having that taken away from them really does like hit hard, right? That hits hard. I think in terms of demographic variation, probably the group where I think I've noticed the strongest kind of bristling or the strongest resistance to surveillance is older drivers, actually, who paradoxically are like the safest drivers. Like the driver you want on the road is the guy, or the driver that has millions of miles under their belt, not the new 18-year-old with the CDL. But 18-year-olds kind of didn't know it any other way, right? Like they're just getting started. Surveillance is so pervasive across so many domains of life that it's not to say it's not objectionable, but I think it hits differently than, if you've been doing this for 50 years. and you're used to being kind of trusted, right? Or you're used to having autonomy, and now you don't have that anymore. And then in terms of your question about kind of who are the advocates, it's interesting that the privacy kind of tech policy groups have not really engaged too much in this sector. There are some trucker groups. So there's a group called, especially the Owner Operator Independent Drivers Association, which isn't a union, but it's like an interest group for truckers who own and operate their own vehicles. And they've brought some successful legal challenges. Actually, I mean, successful in that they've delayed some of the regulation that has mandated surveillance over drivers. Ultimately unsuccessful in the long run, but bought drivers another decade or so in terms of ensuring that they would be free from this kind of oversight. So there is some activity. Unionization in trucking, I think, is probably not something I expect anytime really soon. The unionization rate is like in the single digits. In some industries, I think that has a lot of promise as a privacy protective measure. I'm less sure that it does in trucking. Yeah.
So, but before I have a couple questions actually from a graduate student who's at Cornell, Catherine Z. So she sent a few questions for us to include.
I think the Slavsky?
Yeah.
Oh,
So,
she's great.
yeah. So before I do that, I just want to pause and we all encounter imposter syndrome in different forms, and I just want the group to know that all of those questions, save for the last one, were written by our undergraduate research assistant and event assistant Kevin, who was a little shy about asking them himself. But I think we'd all agree that those were exceptional questions.
They were great. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah. So Kevin, great job. Okay. Question from Catherine Z. Can you talk about how corporations make decisions about incorporating technology into their workflow, like efficiency, saving money, well-being of workers, retaining jobs? How do they do that?
Such a good question. So I think efficiency is like the name of the game, right? I think all corporations speak the language of efficiency and cost savings and risk reduction, right? Like those are very, very familiar. Productivity, right? Preventing, what they sometimes think of as like shrinkage or wage theft or, shirking, things like that. Like that's the language of the corporation when it comes to more closely managing workers, right? Like make sure that they're getting their money's worth or getting, having workers put their full selves into the work. The irony of that, of course, is that like what looks like efficiency to the corporation is often not like reducing waste or reducing, slack, but it's actually just like moving the burden of that extra work onto the worker, right? From management to the worker. So just to give you like one example of this from not trucking, but from a different context, there's been like a real push recently to do schedule shifts algorithmically. Maybe folks have read about this. Where companies now do what's a practice that's sometimes called just-in-time scheduling, where instead of kind of knowing what your shifts are going to be well in advance or having fairly regular shifts, companies engage in a variety of practices where they try to like use data from sales and to some extent they've always used some sales data, but they use much more current data or much more dynamic systems to try to forecast in a much more granular way like how much business they expect to be in a store or in a restaurant. And often with very, very little notice to workers, right? So that workers end up, and this is super well documented, that this is very harmful to workers, right? Because workers end up having very little notice of what shifts they're going to work, or their shifts are split up into little chunks, right? Or they have, they have to be on call for shifts without actually getting paid until, sales reach a certain amount. Like there's a huge variety of practices that kind of fall in this just-in-time scheduling label. And that looks efficient for the company, right? Because to the company, all that means is that they've minimized their labor costs relative to their revenue. But of course, like they actually haven't saved labor, right? All they've done is created labor, created insecurity for workers who now like can't work a second job or can't take care of their kids or can't take classes, right? And like that's a really stark example, but I think there's lots of them, of ways in which the language of efficiency really masks the fact that all of that is it's not going anywhere, right? Inefficiency actually like is saving that same amount of labor and work and risk, but it's just moving it to people who are less equipped to stomach it.
So we're going to take our first question from the audience. So that will be Andrea Adams, who's another colleague who's in the space who studies surveillance. We also had Mike Miller. I don't know if you know Mike. He runs the Just Tech program over at SSRC. So me and Andrea have designs on the four of us writing a paper. We don't know what it's about yet.
I'm in. Count me in.
But we're looking at you. Okay, Andrea, start us off.
So I looked at your video and I really enjoyed it. And so one of the things that I was I was getting from you is that it seems like truckers have a great identity, and that they feel really passionate about being truckers. And I was wondering, is the intrusion of these wearables, sensors and stuff like that, does it seem to have an impact on their identity, or do they feel like it's an invasion of their privacy, or what are they feeling about that? Because I just think that this notion of masculinity around that is probably impacted by you wearing this and having all these other kinds of things going on. So that's my first question.
I love that question. Thank you, Andrea. I think you're dead on, right? I think the way you described it is exactly what's happening, right? So it's a profession in which the occupational culture is really strong, and it's very closely tied to stamina and to bodily self-knowledge, right? So knowing if you are okay to drive, right? Like knowing the things I was alluding to earlier, right? Like knowing your route from here to there, trusting yourself, right? Like having the experience of being on the road for a long time. And all of that is like very acutely undermined when I now tell you, like, actually, like, I don't think you can do it, and I don't trust you to know yourself well enough to stop when you need to stop, right? So, like, it's a different sense of the word autonomy than we sometimes use in technology when we're talking about autonomous vehicles, but the personal autonomy, right, the self-knowledge and the stamina, I think get really, really directly impacted, and in this very acute way, because of kind of just the dignity of the work, right? I think oftentimes when we talk about labor and technology, it's kind of easy to focus on like, well, how many jobs are going to be lost, right? Or kind of like things we can measure, right? As is often the case, we tend to focus on things we can measure, like, the shrinkage of an industry or something like that. But it's much harder to actually like get our hands around a concept like worker dignity, I think, where it's hard to measure, like, how does this job feel now, right? Like, is this a job in which a person can take pride? Is this a job that somebody can feel like they're providing for their family, using their body in the way that they know how, and like using their brain in the way that they know how? And I think that really gets imperiled in a way that's hard to put our fingers on by some of these wearables and biometrics.
I'm going to jump in with a question before I open it up to Erica, Daniel, and Rebecca. So sticking with wearables, I'm wondering, and this isn't something I've explored, but I'm wondering if there's anything in the literature comparing different industries with wearables. I attended a great talk by Lisa Ho, who's the former privacy officer for UC Berkeley, on wearables and athletes. And I'm wondering, it could be an interesting comparison, and also interesting to think about, the what could happen with that data is wildly different after the fact. But I wonder if you come across any comparisons. I mean, are there other industries where wearables are a thing?
That's a really good question. I mean, the other place where I feel like we've seen reporting on it is like in the context of warehouse work, right? Where the wearable is like this recent Amazon expose about like measuring time, what they call time off task, right? Which is like you had to go to the bathroom or something, right? Or you like paused to take a drink of water to talk to somebody, where they measure it in this like second by second way using a wearable. And I think the way that they justify putting the wearable into the work environment, and I think some places do it with headsets too, or like with goggles or something, is through things like augmented reality. Like the thing, I'm pretty sure, and you'd have to check me on the facts here, but I think something like Amazon's sensor will like buzz to tell you which direction to walk or like which thing to pick from the shelf, right? So it has some utility for the worker, but of course, like a latent function that's very valuable to Amazon is then also to do this really close supervision. So I don't really, it's a really good question. I haven't seen much that like, that's all just from news reporting. Like I haven't seen much that sociologically kind of unpacks what the effects on workers are of wearables in different industries, but it seems like a good paper to write.
Andrea, we've got our paper. Okay. All right, Erica.
You found it. Got it.
Erica, you're next. That's ours. Nobody scoop it or steal it. Erica, you're next. Go ahead.
Okay, so I also watched your video, and I have two questions related with that. So based on your research, do you think the use of automatic tracking in the trucks has provided any improvement in the truck's daily work? And then the other question is, you mentioned that in your video that the trucks, they are paid by mile that they drive. Do you know if there are any company that have a different system, and what for you personally, do you think that would be the best system to pay truckers?
So yeah, great questions. Thank you so much, Erica. In terms of your first question about like, is there any kind of material improvement for truckers or like, is there a silver lining for them? I think the only one that I have been able to identify is that some of the data that's collected by the systems that are put in folks' trucks, and this is less the biometrics, but more just kind of the broader kind of surveillance apparatus, like these, GPS trackers and things that are determining where they are and when, is that has enabled us to collect some aggregate data about how much truckers have to wait when they get to like a place where they need to load or unload. This is called detention time in the industry. I can't remember if I talked about this in that talk or not. But basically truckers have to wait for a really long time. It's kind of like when you get to the airport and there's like no, what do they call it? There's no like gate for you, right? Like truckers are subject to having to wait for a gate for a long time when they go to different places. And the time that they're waiting is unpaid, and it can be like multiple hours. Like it's a really long time. It's a super well-known driver of fatigue in the industry. Truckers will tell you like, this is the problem, right? Is that our clocks are running out and we're not getting paid. We're just like sitting here waiting for 4 hours. And it's been hard, like truckers have known that for a long time, but it's been hard to quantify that for policymakers so that they might be able to do something about it. And like one tiny silver lining of tracking truckers is now we also have a better kind of data handle on the detention time problem. So what some groups have started to do is like use that data, collect that data from truckers voluntarily, and then use that to kind of write analyses that they either first give back to truckers so they can almost like, when you see how long you would have to wait at a restaurant from Google, right? Like now truckers can for those truckers who can decide which loads they want to pick up, they can see, oh, like the average wait time at this place I might take a load is 5 hours or something. That's ostensibly somewhat useful to them. And it can be useful to the Department of Transportation when it's making new regulations. As to your second question about kind of pay, right, like one of the major kind of underlying problems in trucking is that truckers are paid in kind of a piecework way, right? They're paid by the mile they're driving, which means they're not paid for detention time. They're not paid for the time they have to rest. They're not paid for the time they have to inspect their trucks. They're not paid for maintenance if they have to stop. They're not paid while they're sitting in traffic. They're not paid for tons of stuff that happens on the road that's real work, right? Like none of that work is compensated, which is a huge problem, right? So I think paying people for the actual work they do is like a good place to start. One reason that doesn't happen in trucking is that truckers are statutorily exempted from the Fair Labor Standards Act, right, which is the law that ensures that most workers have overtime protections and other workplace protections. And truckers just don't get that, right? Like the law does not require that. But covering truckers under the Fair Labor Standards Act would obviously be a huge help, right? Would enable them to actually make some money for the time that they're working.
I'm seeing we had a missed opportunity the other day. We had the chief economist for I think it was the AFL-CIO, if I'm correct. Remind me, folks, does that sound right? Is that who came from Howard?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was also, I guess, Assistant Secretary of Labor. I think you two would have had a fun discussion.
I would have loved that.
Next year. Next year. So, okay, so before I turn over to Daniel, I have a question. The trucking industry, externally, it looks like both dangerous and exploitive and is also highly romanticized, as you mentioned. When we look at large-scale data on this and other industries, how do we identify what parts of the industry are dangerous and or exploitive, especially when these industries are romanticized versus sort of what's okay? How do you make that determination?
It's a great question, right?
It's a Catherine Z question.
I'm going to have to write her after this.
Seriously, yeah.
Did she come? Is she part of?
She was supposed to be our run our workshop, and she got COVID.
Oh,
and
no.
since she couldn't come, she said, anything I can do, let me know. And I was like, do you know Karen? She's like, oh my gosh, I love Karen. So she wrote a bunch of questions. So, but back to you, and then we'll turn over to Daniel.
Okay. Well, so that question, it's a great question, right? And part of it, I think, actually relates to Erica's question. So like, how do you know if something is exploitative when there's like a selective labels problem, right? Like we don't know how much truckers are driving that's not being recorded. Like, how do you know what's not being recorded? Hard to tell, right? Like we can rely on survey data, which we do. Increasingly, we're relying on this data that I was just alluding to, right? Like having truckers kind of donate their data anonymously to groups that can kind of track some of the stuff kind of in the aggregate. So that is something. But we haven't been able to actually get like a great handle on how much truckers actually work, which is, I think, a big part of the question, right? Of like, how do you know if it's exploitative? It's been hard to get a handle on that specifically because it's not recorded, right? Like that's what the industry relies on, is kind of this shadow work, this ghost work happening, kind of under the veil of what truckers are internalizing. The other aspect of it, right? You might think like, well, one way to kind of get a handle on this is to just ask people. And I definitely am in favor of, I'm a qualitative researcher, so I like asking people. Even there, I think you have to think really critically about what you're learning. So one experience I had when I was doing the research for the book was I was talking to some driver and he was like, so I mentioned this kind of notion of like cultural cowboyism, right? Or kind of like, being kind of flippant and like talking about how much you hate the government and, being like pretty libertarian in one's leanings, right? Which is like that culturally, that's kind of like, a line in trucker culture is to just like be disparaging towards the government. And it's not entirely undeserved because the government has not treated them particularly well. But there's kind of this cowboyist notion. And like I was talking to this one driver and he was kind of like also being kind of like profane and not, like making it sound like it was all some kind of game. And then he stopped towards the end of our interview and he said, like, I just need you to know that like all of this is not, I don't want to curse, but there was profanity in it. I think the quote is in my book, but he said like, this is not.
Oh, you can curse. You can curse, Karen. You're an
okay.
associate
There were a lot of
professor.
fucks in the statement. He said, but one of the things he said was, this is not a fucking party. We make it sound like it is, but it's not, right? Like you've been going 24 hours without sleep. You're behind the wheel of an 80,000 pound vehicle. You haven't slept. Your kids are at home. You need this money, right? Like we make it sound like, and there could be a cop. Like his full quote is really powerful and I can't repeat it verbatim. But the way he put it was like so striking to me because I was kind of buying into this idea of like, oh, isn't this fun? Like these are just like some cowboys who enjoy the chase or something, or this is just who they are. But as he explained it to me, right, like that is not it, right? Like that's a necessity, right? They need to do that because of the economic situation, the political situation they're in. They like just lack power politically and economically. And so a lot of times, digging into that, it takes, I think ethnographic work helps. It takes like really trying to uncover like what is the root of the problem that they're facing. And in many ways, the root of the problem they're facing is not surveillance, right? The root of surveillance is a symptom of the problem. But the real problem is just economic powerlessness, right? Is just deep inequity in the way workers are treated.
So Daniel has our next question, but I'd like to shout out Grace, who wrote in the chat box, if anyone's interested in learning more about truckers, I'd recommend The Big Rig.
Totally. Great book.
Good book.
Love
Grace might come back and ask you something about that later. Come on, Grace, you got a question. Come on, Daniel, go ahead. You got this. Can I also say I'm feeling surveilled by your paintings? Is anyone else like, why are those eyes staring at me? And one of them's like bigger than the other, so it's like it's sort of looking at me. I love it. Go ahead, Daniel.
Somebody must describe it to me as a surveillance Applebee's. You know how Applebee's has like weird stuff on the wall.
All the flare. You've got surveillance.
This is my surveillance flare.
Surveillance flare. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wasn't feeling surveilled by your wall, but I was thinking how pretty it was.
Oh, well, thank you.
Maybe get a compliment on it.
That's how they get you, Daniel. You don't realize.
Right, that's how they pull you in.
That's how they pull you in.
The mystification, yeah. Thank you for joining us, Associate Professor Levy. This is, I weirdly have and I didn't get to introduce myself because I was making my lunch earlier, but I'm a Ph.D. student in the Department of Sociology at UC Berkeley. And I weirdly have a personal connection to this topic because my sister is a truck driver. She is also a mask-presenting lesbian truck driver, which has made for a very interesting experience for her. And I'm very interested in the sort of impending AI revolution as it relates to trucking. I'll never forget, years ago, I went to a talk at MIT by Kai-Fu Lee, who's the author of this book called AI Superpowers. And one of the general takeaways from this talk was that he was sort of talking about the industries that are well positioned to be run by AI in the future, one of which was trucking. And so I have that talk in my mind. And then like years later, my sister is telling me she's becoming a truck driver. And I remember one of the first thoughts that I had, I was like, well, how long is she going to have that job if this like impending AI revolution is coming? And it's not something that she talks about, right? AI. My sister is not college educated, as I'm sure you know, most truck drivers aren't. And so, and there's also just like a lot of distance in social space between like the people in this room and most truck drivers. And so that coupled with the fact that they're not collectively organizing, which I wasn't aware of how low those rates of unionization were. But I just think a lot about like how prepared are truckers for this AI revolution? Like, are they, and I know that, you know, the more local routes will be, you know, the AI will be driving the trucks longer distance to maybe a hub where there'll be like drivers who are doing more local routes. It seems that there's going to be some level of worker displacement here. And it does not seem like truck drivers are very well positioned to safeguard themselves against the potential worker displacement that's coming from AI. And I'm just wondering if that sort of aligns with what you observed, if you have any thoughts on just like how prepared they are for that AI revolution. What role do you think that they will be playing in that, if that makes sense?
That makes total sense. And that was, I really like the way you framed that comment. I think you are so dead on when you acknowledge kind of the social distance, both between kind of the academy and, you know, working class labor, but also between kind of just the way we tend to talk about AI. Like you mentioned this MIT talk by Kai-Fu Lee, right? And the notion of the AI revolution and how like, oh, actually this industry is so, and there are like plenty of good reasons, right? Including the so-called labor shortage, and including the capabilities of autonomous vehicles and the advancements that there have been in the last few years, to think like, oh yeah, this is like an industry in the crosshairs, right? Like from the outside, that certainly appears true. But I think the distance is exactly the point, right? I think if you actually, like, I would love to talk to your sister maybe at some point. I'm so curious what she would say to you about this, right? Like, I have been so hard pressed to find truckers who give a shit about the AI revolution. And I don't necessarily think that's because it's coming for them and they just don't know it. I think it's because the work of driving a truck is a lot more than driving a truck, right? Being a truck driver entails more than driving a truck. I'm sure your sister would say, I imagine she would say, she would be able to give us a list of 100 other things she does that are not just driving. Just to be clear, autonomous trucks are also not perfect drivers, right? Like, so there's a long way to go, just even on that. But like the autonomous truck is not going to interface with a customer. It's not going to change a flat tire. It's not going to secure a flatbed load. People are like not going to be okay with driving next to a 100,000 pound autonomous vehicle anytime soon. So, and if you talk to folks in the industry, I went to a conference a couple of years ago with trucking like company executives, and they said they put about a 40-year timeline on AI, like being a significant, like on autonomous vehicles, like occupying a significant amount of their expenditure. So like, I think the technological stuff is like starting to happen, but I think like the distance between now and full autonomy really affecting workers is much longer than folks who work in AI like would like to admit. That's not to say it's not going to happen, right? That's not to say that like, you know, 50 years from now, we'd be having the same conversation, or, you know, that there would still be the same number of human drivers. I think the more immediate concern is that what it is to be a driver will be different, right? Like AI will definitely, and maybe already is, affecting folks like your sister, but not necessarily by like taking her job away, just changing what it is that her job looks like, right? Changing, you know, what roles she's subjected to, changing how much her company knows about her at any given time, things like that, right? And so those are both concerns, right? Those are both simultaneous threats. And I feel like, you know, the AI kind of discourse has been really bad at keeping like multiple things in our minds at once. Like it tends to be like very alarmist or very kind of dispassionate and like denying that anything is ever going to happen. And I think neither one of those is like a really sound, nuanced position, right? Like keeping in mind short-term harms and long-term harms at the same time, I think is really crucial. Anyway, I love that question. I would love to talk more about that, but
So it sounds like there's a new paper after our paper with you and Daniel there, and I think we should add your sister to it too, Daniel. Like totally. You know, going back to our panel this morning about how often we're studied and not included. That would be really cool if both you and your sister were your names are on the paper. So we've got 4 questions in the queue. I want to remind folks that they're office hours. You can spend 10 minutes with this amazing associate professor and maybe outline your paper, Daniel. So why don't we get Rebecca and Imani on screen together, and you'll both ask your questions, then we'll answer, and then we'll do the same with Susanna and Grace.
All right, that sounds great. So Karen, I really enjoy your video, but unfortunately, you know, a lot of people ahead of me already asked my questions. So I'm gonna go ahead and then, so I look at your research and I found you have a very interesting analysis theme is about intimate partner violence. So I'm very interested in that because I also do a lot of research about it. There are some papers about it that you do like spyware, privacy threats, and then how intimate partner abusers exploit a technology. I was just wondering if you can spend like few minutes to give us an idea about that topic of your research.
My question is kind of a follow-up to what was just discussed. So my question is, how do you go about, I guess, or what things do you consider ethically when you're studying communities that you're not necessarily a part of, or you don't really, or you may not identify with?
That's a great question. I'm so glad you asked that, both of you. So just very briefly, let me answer Rebecca's question about IPV. I tend to just I choose the most depressing topics. But yeah, I do have like a line of research that kind of focuses on intimate partner violence and on technology threats that come from within families. I think I choose families and work are kind of like my two focus areas because they have some commonalities, right? They're places where I think many of us kind of interface with surveillance and privacy concerns more so than we might from like the NSA or something. Like those are obviously threats too, but I think we feel the threats from our employers or from our partners in ways that are just more acute for many people, right? These kind of like quotidian workaday kinds of surveillance really interest me a lot. So I spent a lot of time trying to kind of understand both abusive relationships, but also relationships that I think we often wouldn't characterize as abusive, like things like elder care. I have a couple of papers on surveillance in nursing homes, parenting, contexts like that. And I tend to choose those contexts, I think, because they are equivocal, right? Because oftentimes there is a care dynamic at play, obviously not in the abuse context, but in many kind of day-to-day contexts, there's, the line about what kind of constitutes a breach of somebody's privacy is actually pretty wiggly, and people differ about what it is. So I find that like intellectually interesting. And then as to your question, Amani, about kind of, ethical engagement in research practices, especially when it comes to a group in which the researcher isn't a part. I love that question. I have a whole appendix to my book where I try to wrestle with that. I think the best answer I have that I can give in like 30 seconds is the first thing is to ensure that you're speaking with and not for. And there's a few ways I've tried to kind of encapsulate that in my own work. One of them is by declining invitations. So I've gotten a lot of invitations to talk to folks who build the technologies I write about, where they tend to want to know, they kind of want me to like narc on truckers. They want to be like, how are they, because a lot of the research that I've done in the book is about like, how are truckers still breaking the rules even though they're not supposed to? And I just like don't accept those invitations, right? For obvious reasons, because that doesn't feel like it's a way to really highlight the voices of the people that I want to be elevating. So that's one thing. I mean, I think another thing obviously is being really reflexive about how one's identity both, allows access and can limit access. So I write in the appendix a little bit about, certainly about my race, about my youth when I started the project, about my gender. There was like a whole episode where I was pregnant when I was doing some of the research which both like opened some doors and closed other ones. So just thinking about and being honest with one's readers about, kind of how one's positioned in the field. I think those are some ways that one can approach that.
I think we got both questions answered there. And I'm not sure I want to cue the group to try and remember something I can't forget, but we had a question for Chris Hoffman the other day about finding ways to insulate ourselves from having to narc on our research folks. There's documentation, I can't remember exactly the form, but we were looking for examples in the social sciences. So I wonder if what you do to protect the people that you're studying, so that if they were doing something illegal, you wouldn't be called upon to testify or to, your words, narc on them. And then we'll I love that. I love that we've cursed, we've narked. Yes, Susanna and Grace, after this, please come on screen and ask your questions after Karen responds.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, I think I know that I'm pretty sure that the form there's like a form you can get through NIH where you don't have to comply with a subpoena, which is one approach. I didn't actually do that. I just solved it by not collecting written. I did oral consent protocols instead of written ones. And I actually know the names of very few of my participants, or at least I don't know their full names. So I couldn't help the feds if I wanted to, which seemed like a good approach. But obviously that's complicated, right, for research ethics reasons. So.
So I still see Grace. I don't know if Susanna is going to join us still. You still okay? So both of you, Susanna and Grace, come on camera and ask your questions, please.
I was wondering, I didn't know you did intimate partner violence as well, but in both of your studies or areas of study, whether it's intimate partner or the truckers, did you at some point came across with truckers that were either immigrants and how that might be different, their immigrant experience versus native born? And I also have, like Daniela, personal interest, because one of my friends who was extremely talented and he was about to be going a brilliant physicist career in Costa Rica, ended up here in the US. He didn't finish college and he's now a trucker, and now his path has completely been different from what his promising future was. So just interested.
First of all, I wanted to say it was great to see you talk. I study care labor and also have interest in low wage labor more broadly, so amazing. So a lot of people in the trucking industry think that owning your own truck and contracting out your work is the way to success in the industry. So I was hoping you can talk about how AI might affect them.
Great questions. Both of those are great. Okay. So for Susanna's question about immigrant communities, it's definitely the case that there are, particularly in certain localities, like in Chicago or in Michigan, like there are other places where there are some immigrant communities that have really kind of galvanized themselves around trucking. So like you'll find a lot of Somalian truckers in Chicago, right? Like, and I actually don't know like the historical roots of each of these, but this is just kind of the way that the industry has developed in some places. And I think that can sometimes mitigate some of these concerns and sometimes not. Oftentimes those groups tend to work for local companies or for companies where they know, like they're not the faceless companies that we might think of as being kind of employers in other contexts. So in some respects, I think that can be useful because sometimes the workplace treatment can be better because you have like a closer relationship or a familial relationship sometimes with the person who's supervising you. Of course, this is a broad statement and I'm sure it varies a lot, but in some contexts, I think that can be a useful kind of counter or can help to ensure better worker treatment in some contexts. At the same time, in the same way as Anne Belay wrote about trans drivers and the way that surveillance can fall upon them in different ways, there's certainly just like really rampant xenophobia against especially drivers of other races and ethnicities in places like truck stops, including in enforcement interactions with law enforcement officers. So unsurprisingly, right, like Black drivers and drivers from different immigrant groups may be treated more harshly in some of those interactions. So, obviously that there's a double-edged sword there. And then in terms of Grace's question about owner-operators, I can tell that you read The Big Rig, which is all about that question. So owner-operator, so for those who haven't read The Big Rig, which is by a sociologist named Steve Viscelli, Viscelli became a truck driver for a long time, which I did not do. And he documents kind of this, like the big rig, right, where the rig is both the truck and this idea that workers should kind of work for themselves and invest a ton of money in predatory loans. There's a bunch of lawsuits going on right now about this practice, and it highlights this notion of kind of freedom and autonomy, but actually drivers end up in these absolutely terrible situations where they like owe thousands and thousands of dollars and they never get out of it. John Oliver just did a really, really good piece actually about this problem a couple of months ago. So I really encourage you to watch that. I thought he encapsulated it really well. In terms of kind of the relationship between that and AI, it's a good question. I think in some ways, owner-operators deal with a little bit less of this than other people because they are working for themselves. At the same time, a lot of owner-operators end up in these long-term lease agreements with big companies. So they kind of lose on both counts in those contexts because they're subject to the same supervision that employee drivers would be, but they don't get whatever job security or benefits that employee drivers might get. So I think it can cut in multiple ways. Okay, this has been great, you guys. I've enjoyed this so much, like way more than I often enjoy talking to folks. These questions are just incredible.
And I can tell you, we've got some folks signed up in office hours right now. Daniel is you two. You're going to write a paper in the next half hour.
I'm into it. I'm ready.
Yeah. So if anybody else is interested, Karen, as you can tell, Karen is just a wonderful human being. And I know we can get intimidated a little sometimes, like, what am I going to talk to her about? Just, okay, we got 2 now. There's 2. Okay. All right, we got 2. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. I think I saw you speak at Princeton or at Berkeley. I'm trying to figure out when it
I
was.
think it might have
We
been at Berkeley. I
absolutely
think we
met.
before.
Yeah, no, but
Yeah.
it's thank you so much for circling back around. It's beautiful to see how your project has evolved. It speaks well of our projects in the future. As Associate Professor Levy, I will write you about that. So everybody, thank you. I'm so excited. I'm in Buffalo a whole lot, so I can swing by. Everybody, please join me in thanking Professor Levy. Thank you all for watching. For more information on SICSS-Howard Mathematica, visit our website, follow us on social media, and join our email list.